Thank you for joining this presentation of the NMRA Virtual Convention. This is an overview of the ARM C38 class model. The original presentation was filmed and 90% of the footage was lost when a device failed. A good reminder to back up everything, but unfortunately that didn't occur at the time of the failure. So this presentation has been produced using parts that were available that were recoverable, and some new parts and a lot of still images which were originally taken when the presentation was made. So hopefully it will be able to be understood. Apologies for any of the inconsistencies in the video. Welcome to a quick overview of the ARM C38 class locomotive. The C38 class locomotives were built by the New South Wales Government Railways. 5 streamlined versions were made. This model here represents the remainder of the class of 30 in a non-streamlined form. As we rotate the model around, we can see some of the details are quite crisply represented. It has nice motion on the model, plastic moulded parts, some metal handrail parts. Background on the front here, we have the Westinghouse air compressor, headlight moulded to the smoke box marker lights, metal handrails that run the full length of the model, a fairly accurately represented Delta truck at the rear, and a reasonably well detailed cab interior for a basic model. Plastic handrails attached at the rear. Spin round to the driver's side, we can see the power reverser is represented, the steam generator or dynamo on the top. Down here we have the representation of the lubricators, steam cylinders, and the Walsh Arts valve gear. On the front of the pilot we have plastic mouldings for the shunters poles, steps, a hook representation, 2 air hoses, moulded buffers with metal heads. Alright, a few bits on the model which we might like to change later on, or while you're doing some extra detailing to it. The handrail on the 38 class on the driver's side is actually the regulator. So the regulator comes from the cab, runs down the handrail here to a quadrant, and then follows along to the actual regulator valve actuator, which is mounted here, which then follows across into the smoke box to the steam valve. Now the model is represented with a nice shiny handrail that doesn't actually go to the regulator mounting point. There's a bit of a sort of an indentation on the boiler, sort of portraying where it should be. So that's one item that can be easily modified by cutting the handrail here, drilling this little hole out and mounting an actual throttle valve in that position. There are cast pieces in brass for that, made by Aussie Detailing Parts, and I'll show you a couple of those later on. Up here, the steam generator or dynamo. Whilst it's a basic representation and you could get away with it by adding maybe a little steam pipe out the top or something like that, there are some nicer cast versions available. So there are 2 companies that I've seen recently that have them, and that's Karobi Models and Aussie Detailing Parts. One is a lost wax casting in brass, and one is a pewter casting. The next area we can sort of think about Up here are the safety valves. 38 has two main safety valves and a third relief valve up in here. Now, whilst these are quite good on the model, several of the models I've come across, these have been sort of not quite right. So the moulding process must be a little bit random. My own particular model, they were actually quite bad to the point where they were sort of not even looking like a safety valve. They were sort of mushroomed. So maybe in the assembly process they've been squashed or whatnot and they've just been fitted. So you can replace these. I found a manufacturer called CalScale, and they produce some nice brass versions of these. We'll just come back a bit here and we'll spin the model around and we'll have a look at the other side. Apologies for the dog. Now right here is one of the most glaring things missing on the model. There is no whistle. A 38 class has a nice big whistle mounted right here on the top of the smoke box, and I'll include a photo of that, of a prototype model. There are several manufacturers that do these, including Aussie Detail Parts and Karobi models. They can be easily placed up on here, and a very good addition to the model. Another item on the model which you may like to change is the expansion link. So here we can see the link in position on the model, and the way the rod connects down to here, and then the actuating angles through to the valve chest up here, it just doesn't look right. It's quite a nice representation of an item here as far as the detail goes, the fineness of the actual links. They all sort of move around quite freely. However, the link just doesn't look like it's positioned right. Visually, when you see the model running, it just doesn't look right. So this isn't quite an easy one to do, to actually modify, and I'll show you some photographs of what a real one looks like in a moment. However, there's a little pin here which can be eased out from the plastic mounting here, and it allows you to then adjust the position of. A very quick and easy way is to pull it out, lift it above the actual pinhole which is drilled in the centre, and allow it to sit back down on the next section along, which will then give the alignment visually a much better angles. The next step further on from that is actually soldering up the original hole and just below it and re-drilling a new pinhole, and then using a Dremel with a motor or a moto tool, cut out the section above the original hole so you have a clear section in the quadrant. It's just one of those things that, to my mind, makes the model look visually much better, and you'll see that on my own model when it's running on those videos. Now, for some people, this modification may be a little bit too much above where they think they can go. And one way I've discovered of actually making it so it's really not noticeable is painting all the valve gear to a darker colour. You'll have a look at most of the photographs of the 38s in service in their later life, and the valve gear had become basically a grungy black colour, or sort of a stained oily colour. And just giving this whole area a coat of a darker colour, painting the rods out into a darker colour, and the motion here hides visually these inaccuracies that we can see here in this link rod, where it looks like it's sort of running down into the track instead of aligning to the cylinder plane. So that is one way we can actually hide the detail here, but visually to the mind, it tricks the mind into thinking everything is right in this location. Disassembling your 38 class, you'll find a pair of screws, one here and one down here on the rear of the model. On the front of the model, you'll find a screw in here which mounts this front bogie assembly. Past that, there is a screw mounted down in here. Get the camera around and we can see that. A little bit down through there. So that's easily accessible once this front bogie is removed by that screw through there. And then the chassis will easily wiggle out from the model. If you want a bit more room at the back here, you can easily remove the rear delta truck by removing this screw here, and that will give you plenty of access room. You won't have to worry about getting the screwdriver past the detail parts at the back of the model here. Now, doing this on camera at funny angle around the camera is a little bit difficult, however it's still quite manageable. And now we can see this other screw right in here. That's the last one you'll need to be able to remove the body from the chassis section. So we'll just undo that, try and hold the screwdriver at the same time. So that's that screw now loose, that's dropped out. Grab a pair of tweezers and we'll grab those rear screws out so we don't lose them as we turn the model upside down, and a little bit of a wiggle, and we're now in pieces. So there we have the chassis section of the model. We can see the European parts here on the motor. Quite easy for you to remove those. People without soldering skills just nip them off here and here, or if you'd like, unsolder them, take the piece away. This is here purely for AM interference, not required here in Australia, and if you're going DCC, you are much better having that item off it, because your DCC decoder is recommended by almost every decoder manufacturer to remove those suppression devices. Okay, here we can see the weight now located inside the boiler. And this is it down here, and we can see the space provided above the boiler, above the weight. Isn't that great? You could fit a little cube speaker in there, a little flat plane one, but it's really just enough space to run a decoder down inside, as you can see there. Now, if your smoke box front is a little bit tight, this is where you run a little bit of a drift through, and I like to use these bits of plastruct, just cut to a length where you can sit it down there, it won't damage anything, and give it a little bit of a tap and the front will come straight off, allowing you to then slide this weight out of the front of the model. Alright, here we can see the handrail just popped out and it will sort of swing aside on the driver's side. The handrail on the fireman's side tends to swing back inwards. This is due to the way it's actually mounted up here. However, you can pull it slightly forward. Here, and it will give plenty of clearance for when the fronts of the smoke box comes off. Alright, just before we take the weight out, there is a screw here, which I forgot to mention earlier, that actually locates the weight solidly to the model. So once you remove that screw, the weight will become loose. Right, after a little bit of a tap, we can just push the smoke box front off from the inside there. You can see it coming off. Very small amount of glue to hold these on, just usually around this very top section, and here we see the weight slid out. Now, for those wondering about putting a decoder in above the weight, if you are not putting sound or something like that in, they've very thoughtfully added a section of 3M, we'll get that the right way around, tape above here. Doesn't quite cover the whole area, but at least there is some insulation there. Okay, here we see the inside of the boiler, so we can look down there, and there is actually plenty of space on the inside of it there. Zoom out a bit maybe. Yeah, so there's plenty of space down in there. Once the chassis goes back in, a bit of that is taken up. I actually might just sit the chassis back in there to give you an idea of what available space is. The machined weight, after it's been to the machine shop, taken a large amount off it, you can actually just see the moulding line in the weight there. So just take it down to just above that, and then we swing it round, and we can see into the front of the model there. This is just sat in there, that's not screwed in, not actually physically fully mounted. But you can see now the position, the weight, and the good size speaker takes up just under the chimney. The big advantage of this is the sound comes out of the right spot of the model, not out of the tender, out of the chimney where the chuff should come out. Whistle as well, 38 class has a whistle mounted right next to the chimney, so your whistle sound will also be coming from exactly the right spot. Another advantage is the weight is probably too heavy for the front of the model. Now, it balances more weight to the front of the model than spreading it evenly over the length of the driving wheels of the model. So taking a little bit out of this weight is not an issue for the model. It will still pull 17, 18 cars on your layout. Okay, so let's turn our attention back to some of the detailing on the model. Items like the headlight here are made of plastic. The dart on the front with the wheel, also a moulded piece. The marker lights, moulded. The little handle for the front of the smoke box door, moulded as well. We can see the moulded detail here. Doesn't really represent the actual item. Same up here. This is the dynamo. And then we've got other bits like these parts here, which are very well detailed. But some people may like to change those out for cast items that are available as well. So what I'll do, I'll put some photos up now of some of the items on the model that you may like to change, and these will be prototype photos. So we'll see a prototype photo of the side of the locomotive here with the dynamo. So the dynamo sits up on the top of the boiler here. Steam fed powers the electrics of the locomotive, so headlights, marker lights. In the modern times, powers a battery to run the ice equipment that they need. So it's a vital part of the locomotive, and it'd be nice to have that modelled nicely on the model. And as I said before, there are parts available for that item. Further up on the boiler, we have that actuator for the throttle. So as you can see in the photograph here, it is quite a noticeable item on the model. So without that represented, the model seems to be lacking something, and that's something we can easily replace with a detailed part. On the other side of the model, turning it round to the other side, we can see items like the whistle. It's so glaringly obvious that the whistle is missing. As you can see in this prototype photo, a missing whistle? Oh, it's wondering what the manufacturer is thinking leaving that off. So hopefully when they do a second run of the model, they'll put a whistle on there. So the handrails on the model, they are bright and shiny, made out of a nice metal, very shiny. Now, photographic evidence would suggest maybe the first green locomotive did have shiny handrails, polished. And maybe one or two locomotives that for a special service may have had the handrails polished. But generally, all the photographs show the handrails actually painted either the body colour or a black colour. Whether the black was just dirt or it was actually painted black is a bit hard to tell. Some of the photographs being black and white, the contrast is hard to tell. But the early colour photos definitely show mostly coloured handrails. So the length of the body, or the boiler length, generally the colour of the boiler. And in some cases they were definitely black. So that's something we can easily change. A fine paintbrush, and you can touch those up very easily. So looking at the prototype photos, just these couple of extra ones, it'll be easy for you to see the variances here on a few different prototype locomotives. Okay, on to removing the electronic parts that aren't needed on this model. The capacitor here is not needed if you're going DCC. And as simple as that, touch the soldering iron on both the tabs and away it comes. There it is there. Now on to fitting the decoder. Very basic on this one. It's a ESU micro, 8-pin connector, a little tether. Pin number 1 is in the lower corner here. Pin number 1 on the 8-pin connectors up here. And we align those two and hopefully we'll just push in. So now we have the decoder mounted. It's time to connect the 2 brown wires to the speaker. The purple wire is an auxiliary, which won't be needed on this particular install. Modification to the base plate involves removing this section of the base plate. 2 screws, one here, and we should be able to remove this section of the base plate to allow access to do the modification. This is the base plate removed. That now gives us access to the pickup strip and plate, which also retains the driving wheels. As we see this plate then eased out of position. I'll tilt it down carefully. This section right here is what we'll pay attention to. That surface there holds the axle bearings, or horn box in reality, up in position. Now that holds it fully up position. No float whatsoever. So with this base plate off, there's a small amount of float. We don't want to give it too much extra float because this is also the driven geared driven axle. But having a little bit of extra downward movement helps massively with that pickup issue. I've just made a little mark there. That is the center line of the axle. Now this has also got a phosphor bronze plate that runs along the side of the plastic retainer. So using the half round file, you can just see that there, we will take a very small amount out here to create a slight curve in that section there, which the bearing can sit down into. So we're talking like 0.0 something of a millimetre extra clearance here, not millimetres of clearance. A very small amount has been taken out here. It's only a small amount, and it's all it needs is just a tiny bit to allow the bearing, which is round in its own surface, to drop down a little bit. Allows the axle to have a little bit of movement, and the center axle will then sit on the rail head all the time, and if there is any downward undulations, it will also track down onto that. While you've got the base plate off, it's also worth checking that these phosphor bronze wiper pickups actually do contact the back of the wheels at the end of their travel. So the wheels have quite a bit of left and right travel, and in some cases, if these phosphor bronze wipers aren't enough tensioned out to the wheel, as they go around a corner, the action of the wheel moving across will make the pickup come out of contact with the wheel. Less pickups equals less electrical reliability. As delivered with the model, this front bogie mount has absolutely no side control. So it's just a floppy arrangement, and it can just move backwards and forwards. Now what side control does is reduce the overhang on a curve of this front section of the locomotive and assist guiding the actual driving wheels into a corner or through a set of points. In a real locomotive, the front bogie has quite a bit of springing in it in this left and right movement, and as the bogie goes into a corner, it acts against the springs and helps to guide the locomotive driving wheels into the corner. Without this on the model, we end up with a large amount of overhang slop going around a corner. So the keen modelers may like to do some modelling here and start to modify this mount. One quick and easy way of giving some small amount of side control is to give it a rear pivot point about here. So a pin can be placed here, another hole here for the pin to actually actuate against, and under the model, if you drill a hole in about here somewhere, you will also give it a pivot point. Those three items there will then provide a small amount of pivot on this bogie from the centre line here to hit the rear, allowing it to guide the locomotive into a corner. The next step from there is to actually provide an actual forward spring, so when it's not just flopping into a corner, it's actually pushing sideways on the locomotive and working just like the real one. Now I've done that on my own locomotive and it works quite effectively. A little hard to show you, but I'll put up a video, in the video, a few photographs. The original part of this got lost on the first video I made. This is the second video I'm making on these models. Unfortunately, all the footage got lost from that first section. So there's a few still shots about to come up. I mounted the bogie with its original factory bracket. However, I drilled some holes at strategic points in the mount, in the actual bogie itself, in the rear section of the bogie, and into the chassis under the boiler section of the model. Now, these gave it a rearward pivot point. Now, that actuation starts to help guide the locomotive into a corner. It's a very rudimentary form, and it only partly does the job. The next part of it is to provide a form of forward actuating spring to come forward from that point to the pivot on the front of the bogie. Now, that was done using a section of phosphor bronze spring, which I then soldered to the original mount across the front there, drilling a hole in the front of the bogie about in this location, and using the phosphor bronze to act as a spring. So the direction of force into the bogie is then at the front of the leading axle, is transferred into the spring back towards the pivot point, and this then actually guides the locomotive into a corner. And it is quite a difference between the standard model and the modified model when it's seen running on a layout. The modified model has several millimeters, up to 5 to 6 millimeters of overhang out on the outside of a corner, as compared to the modified model where it tracks fairly close to the center line of the curve. So it's a modification for a modeler that is actually worth doing. Some trial and error may be needed. I don't think my solution is 100% perfect, but as a basic first attempt, without going outside the bounds of the production model, so using parts from the production model without doing any real serious modifications, it has resulted in the effect required to give side control on the front of the locomotive, and it actually works. Whilst we've got the bogies off the locomotive, the rear delta truck, you should also check the gauging of this one. So bring the gauge in there and we can see it will not go in the back, so the back-to-backs are under gauge on this wheel set as well. Easily to remove this one, screw right here, undo, pop the base plate out, and the wheel is then free to be adjusted. Right, with the screw removed, the base plate should come out and the wheel can be removed, and we can then gauge the wheel with the back-to-back gauge. As you can see here, this is quite a bit under this this wheel compared to the gauge, so this will need a good adjustment. Alright, wheel has been adjusted here, slides nicely in and out of the gauge, and we can reassemble it into the Delta truck. Sits down there, probably worth giving it a bit of a lube while you're there, because there is absolutely no lubrication on these from the factory. So a little drop of oil on these 2 points here will go a long way to the life of this bogie in the model. And we'll check the gauging on this axle as well. So there we go, it's well under. And the rear one here, flip that over so we can get better access to it, also well under. Not quite as bad, that one, because you could almost get the gauge in, but we'll need to pop them out, screws here, and adjust the gauge on those as well before refitting to the model. The tender of the ARM C38 class is quite nicely detailed. It has a moulded coal load, a toolbox, water hatch detail, a very nicely detailed ladder on the rear and steps to the rear of the tender, moulded marker lights, a couple of air hoses, buffers, and we can see the front floor plate area there, and the coal plate. Brake wheel on the left hand side. Now, something unusual with this tender compared to the majority of ready-to-run models is the wheel arrangement. It has solid bogies. Well, not even bogies, it's just a solid chassis with bogie or the wheels mounted. Very reminiscent of the old Hornby Flying Scotsman. After they went from tender drive to loco drive, they had a fairly solid chassis underneath those tenders with a bit of play in the sides. Now, this actually runs quite well if the wheels are engaged. So what I'll do here, I'll pop out a set of wheels and we'll check the gauging on them. And then we'll move on to the next step of the tender. So pop one of these wheel sets out. And I have a brass wheel gauge here. And we can see this wheel set is well under gauge. It will not fit into the gauge there for the back-to-back. So make a small adjustment there. Oh, a little bit more. And there we see the wheel slide into the gauge. And with all the wheels set to the right gauge, these tenders actually track quite well on the track. So that's something to note. If you're not doing any modifications and going with the Control P tender, check your back-to-back gauge on your tender wheels. Use the NMRA gauge, or like I've done, you can have a proper gauge made up, which is a lot easier to use. It spaces it perfectly for you, that one there. The factory tender comes with a coupler mount on the rear, suitable for an NEM coupler from KD. So the little slots there allow the coupler to push in and sort of retained, I guess, by this undercover plate here. Onto the disassembly of the tender. Now the body is a clip fit, so you grab the sides of it, give it a bit of a twist and it will pop off. Now this tender underframe has already had the weights removed on it because we're partway through the build on the other tender. Modifying the tender on the 38 class using the Control P tender kit. So here we see the packaging that comes with the Control P tender kit. This is a 3D printed model, separate bogies, comes with multiple buffers, so you get a choice of buffers. The details are there, you can see it, controlpmodels.com.au. They have a website, you can purchase directly from that website. Great service by the promoter of this. The design is very good. The printing is super crisp and smooth. There are very fine striation lines which are nearly invisible. Basically, you can't see them, unlike a lot of 3D printing you get. And for, I think, a production price of about $50, it is well worth getting. Saves a lot of heartache in trying to modify the actual original tender, which we can see has that solid arrangement, giving you proper bogies, nice wheels, comes with all the screws, even comes with the KD coupler and screws to mount the KD coupler. Definitely worth the modification. The biggest advantage of the Control P tender is it actually has proper bogies on these tenders. So these tenders, tip it at that angle, are 3D printed, and they come with everything you need to build the tender. Comes with couplers, bogies with the wheels already fitted to them, screws, detailing parts like buffers, two types of buffers. You get a choice between the tapered Turton buffers or a standard set of straight shanked buffers, or camel I think they call them, which would normally be used for a KD coupler. The Turton buffers were fitted prior to knuckle couplers being fitted to the 38 class tenders when they were hook draw gear. So with the 38 class Control P tender, we have a rotating bogie. A big advantage over the standard factory tender with its solid axle arrangement and no floating tenders. Now it is actually possible to cut these frames off, which are quite nicely detailed, and make a bogie out of them. A couple of the guys in the NMRA groups have done that and used the original base of the tender and the original parts and made bogies out of them. Additional to the Control P tender, something you may like to add is tender pickups. Keeping in mind that the locomotive from the factory only picks up from the 6 driving wheels, adding some extra pickups greatly increases the reliability of the model, especially when you move to DCC. In this case, I've added a section of PC board to the underside of the bogie. The wires come through the chassis, a couple of phosphor bronze wipers to the back of the wheel, and that provides very good extra pickup. This locomotive will run around the club layout with no pickup issues whatsoever, even with dead frog points and the like on the layout. The ARM 38 comes with the standard style of drawbar, a plate with 2 holes located in it to give a close couple and a long position. Currently this unmodified version here at the front has the close couple position, which gives just enough to go around a corner of a standard sort of point, or probably a 24-inch radius curve. Much more and it will start to bind up on the back of the model and you may get some derailing issues. So you'd have to go to the longer hole position, which gives quite a large gap between the loco and tender. To overcome this on my own model, I've experimented with a sprung drawbar. Now I've been doing this on my O-scale models for a long time, and so I thought I'd give it a go on the HO version. So the drawbar uses part of the wiring harness and a pin, and it is actually sprung. So the wiring harness runs through the same section as the pin, and it can open up and then come back, pull out, and it snaps back into position. So a set of rubbing blocks was mounted on the Control P tender. You can just see the block in there. Oh, lock the camera. One on the left hand side, one on the right hand side, A little bit of shaping on those so they give a smooth rubbing surface on the back of the locomotive. So with it completely compressed, it sits on both of them. As it goes around a corner, it will pull out and you can get to quite a tight corner. So that there is well under your 18-inch radius without applying enough pressure that would derail the tender. And you can see it there, well open, yet you've got that nice close coupled look. Pulls out and snaps back together. You can see that in those videos of this particular locomotive running on the layout, that it looks quite good close coupled. And here's a view from the underside. So we can see those rubbing blocks, and as the locomotive goes around the corner, pressure on those rubbing blocks pulls it away from the locomotive, pulls the spring pressure out and doesn't create any locking situation. Pull away, comes back. The original pin there is still on this model, and you can see the mounting hole, screw hole here, where the drawbar was mounted. Here you can see the operation of the marker lights on the front of the locomotive. The marker lights and the headlight are LED surface mounts. The actual optics for the marker lights are fibre optic through the brass casting, leading back to a surface mount LED on the inside of the smoke box cover. The headlight LED is mounted inside it with a 0402, I think they call it, surface mount LED. There is a red and a white marker light on this model, and a yellow or warm white headlight. The DCC system used in this model is by ESU Lock Sound, with a sound file I've produced using some of the best parts available in the ESU templates page, and sound recordings I've done myself of 38 class locomotives, and a few other sound recordings of 38 class locomotives provided by people from different periods in time. One of the whistles goes back to the 1950s as a recording. It's on the sound file. Another one is from a 1990s recording of 3830 and one of 3801 prior to its session of operation for overhaul. So there's a little bit of options there for whistles, so you can have 3 or 4 different sounding 38 classes. So summing up, the ARM 38 class is a budget model at a recommended retail price of around $300, available from a lot of suppliers at under that, about $285 I've seen it. It is keenly priced, quite a bit cheaper than any other New South Wales or Australian steam locomotive on the market. A few shortcomings of the model are easily fixed by the modeler, and extra detail can be added, or a little bit of paintwork to disguise some of the model's shortcomings, and no one will really know when it's running around at that viewing distance on the layout. Would I buy another one? Definitely yes. It's one of those models that you can get stuck into doing some modifications and not have a real worry, am I damaging that really expensive model? I have several brass models of 38 classes, and would I be going and cutting them up? No, because at the current value of those models, it would be probably devaluing them. So getting a plastic model that you can add detail to and flog around the layout without having to worry whether you really wear it out, it's definitely worth the $285 and a few dollars on extra detail parts and adding a nice sounding decoder to the model. So with that speaker mounted in the front of my model and the other one here, they really bark as they run around the layout. So you've probably heard at the beginning the locomotive running, and I'll run a few more videos at the end here so you can see the models running around the layout. Alright, Thank you for watching the presentation.
Oh, you're going down the hill. Did you want that?
That's all right.
It was down somewhere. Yeah. Done by somebody.
Yeah, that was a very good one to draw. sorry.